Yo, yo, howdy, howdy. I'm gonna run a quick sound check. Hopefully, we're not having terrible mic issues again, so let's just check this out real quick. Hopefully, we're not having terrible mic issues again, so let's just check this out real quick. Beautiful. Hopefully, we're not having. Sounds good. And we're here to learn. So I decided to jump onto this paper, basically continuing on down this rabbit hole. Eventually it'll lead us back somewhere. It's kind of a supplementary thing I'm doing here, topic of interest. And again, in response to a video, hopefully I'll be able to go back and review the content of that video in the near future or whatever, but right now I'm kind of winging it and doing this stuff on the fly. 8 o'clock p.m., June 27th. It's a Thursday. Fortunately, our AA meeting got canceled for tonight, so well, it is what it is. So, source is down in the description box here. I went to a Stanford publication on the history of the lungs. And we're just going to read through this a little bit. Hope everybody is doing well this evening. I am doing fucking fantastically. And I hope you are as well. I guess quick update on my situation report here. Some minor complications on the business end of things, but essentially my ongoing treatment plan is progressing positively. We'll just say that. So I will be here at this spot until Sunday. I'll be discharged on Sunday, go and pick up my car, and start my outpatient program bright and early Monday morning, and kind of keep the ball rolling on that. So that's where I'm at there. A lot of positive things happening in my life right now. So just staying grateful for those things, and trying to use this natural energy I have for the forces of good. So yeah, that's where I'm at tonight. So yeah, so we've been talking about um, evolution. And for those who either deny evolution or have some take up some issue with various aspects of the process of evolution, specifically here, the transition, generally speaking, aquatic species to terrestrial species, and the evolution of the human lung, um, as we understand it. There's a general scientific consensus on this subject. And if you need a refresher on scientific consensus, we talked about that in the last installment of this thing I'm doing here. So, yeah, right now it's just kind of as I said, I'm winging it. But this will probably be part of an ongoing series once I kind of refine the focus of study here, and start taking it in the direction that my, you know, again, there's a general theme here, obviously. Trusty ape, trusty ape. If you don't know, it's a hashtag TrustyApeCo at TrustyApeCo, and also at ApeTrusty on Twitter. All appropriate links are in the description box. So we'll just get right into this article here. Saw Daniel Berry Sports highlights down there. Good to see you. Okay. So we start with a quote from Leonardo da Vinci. The substance of the lung is dilatable and extensible, like the tinder made from a fungus, but is spongy, and if you press it, it yields to the force which compresses it, and if the force is removed, it increases again to its original size. Okay. Early descriptions of the lungs emphasize their importance as cooling agents that maintain the balance of the human body by counteracting the hot temperament. The hot temperament of the heart. They also understood that breathing occurred in the lungs, in essence, that the lungs acted like a pair of bellows firing and cooling a furnace. Galen's description, for example, of the lung emphasized that it has all the properties which make for easy evacuation, for it is very soft and warm, and is kept in constant motion. He further specified the function of the lungs in relationship to the movement of blood as follows. Blood passing through the lungs absorbed from the inhaled air the quality of heat, which it then carried into the left heart. From such passages, we can see that the idea of respiration was primarily influenced by humoral theories of the body. Medieval medical practitioners continued to be fascinated by the unusual anatomy of the lung. They noted its unusual moisture, for example, as a feature of its complexion. In the early 11th century, the Islamic medieval philosopher Avicenna wrote in his Canon of Medicine, quote, in the case of the lung, the moisture is not inherent in its nature, but is derived from the nourishment which comes to it. The lung is fed by a very hot blood, because there is much bilious humor in the blood going to the lung. Or bilious humor in the blood going to the lung. The great excess of moisture accumulates in the lung from the gaseous products of the whole body as well as from the materials which flow down to it from the head. By the late 12th century, Master Nicholas summarized well the qualities of the lungs. It was built to withstand the warmth of the heart. Its soft, spongy tissue facilitated motion. It was hollow in order to retain air, for cooling the heart and renewing the vital spirits, and it exhibited a twofold motion that further facilitated its role as the flail of the heart. Medieval and Renaissance physicians understood the connection between the lungs and respiration and between life and breath. They associated life with a vitality that coursed through the body, a Galenic pneuma. But they had no specific understanding of the role that oxygen played, since they had no chemical understanding of air, which was one of the four basic elements of nature in traditional Greek science. Despite this fact, they did understand that the lung discharged wastes. Leonardo da Vinci describes this process as follows in his unpublished notebooks of the late 15th century. From the heart, impurities, or sooty vapors, are carried back to the lung by the way of the pulmonary artery, to be exhaled to the outer air. His contemporary, the physician Alessandro Benedetti, concurred, writing in 1497, quote, the lung changes the breath as the liver changes the chyle into food for the vital spirit. Despite Leonardo's carefully drawn images of the anatomy of the lungs as seen in the illustration here, he did not yet understand the relationship between form and function in any great detail. What he, like many early anatomists, had grasped was the lung's important role as an organ that worked cooperatively with closely allied organs and structures in the human body. What he understood, as the passage below suggests, is that the mechanical process of breathing, but not the actual mechanisms at work in creating a breath. Quote, the gust of wind driven out of the lung in the generation of a large breath comes from the aid of the abdominal wall, which compresses the intestines, and they elevate the diaphragm, which compresses the lungs, end quote. Renaissance anatomists stuck closely to a complexion theory of the lungs that also gave them a role in the psychology of the human body. Leonardo's contemporary, the physician Alessandro Benedetti, wrote in 1497 that the lungs controlled emotions, such as anger, by placating the passions. With the breath of the spirit from the hollow fistulae of the lungs, thus anger, otherwise implacable, is easily calmed. Similarly, some anatomists endowed the lungs with powers of discernment that prevented them from accepting bad air into the human body. Just as the lungs could make food for the body, they could also prevent poisonous thoughts and substances from overwhelming it. The more careful anatomical studies of the human body conducted by Renaissance anatomists yielded a more precise physical description of the lungs, whereas Master Nicholas had described the human lung as having 7 lobes. Early 16th century anatomists reduced that number to 5. They noted that the sponginess of the lungs facilitated breathing. Though the nature of breathing was still described much as Galen had done, quote, so that they may more easily draw the spirit into themselves, end quote, was how Andreas de Laguna put it in 1535. Yet, only a few decades later, we can begin to see emerging doubts about the kind of spirit flowing through the lungs. Quote, this air is not a pure element, but an airy body, and thus can nourish, wrote Vesalius's contemporary Nicola Massa in 1559. Although Galen, that great philosopher, thought he understood it in another sense, for air prepared in the lung itself nourishes or restores the spirit. Writing from an entirely different philosophical tradition, the Germanic mystic and medical reformer Paracelsus made the study of lung diseases at the beginning of the 16th century a case study in understanding how disease might be localized to a specific organ rather than a general imbalance of the body. In his On the Minor Sickness, he identified lung-related ailments, especially silicosis, as a direct product of working in the mines. Such research further emphasized the importance of the lungs to the overall health of the body. By the early 17th century, the new anatomy of the lung was in place. William Harvey concurred with his Renaissance predecessors on the 5-lobe structure of the lungs. Yet he took their view several steps further in describing the significance of the lungs. Having already established a new physiology of the body in his On the Circulation of Blood, 1628, Harvey had a different understanding of the relationship between arteries and veins. No longer separate circulatory systems within the body, but a unified system. As a result, he had a question. What makes arterial blood different from venous blood? In his famous work, Harvey had described in great detail pulmonary transit in the lungs. As a result, he had the following to say about the lungs in his Lectures on the Whole of Anatomy in 1653. Quote, preeminence of the lung. Nothing is especially so necessary, neither sensation nor ailment. Life and respiration are complementary. There is nothing living which does not breathe, nor anything which breathing which does not live. This insight was followed by a strong critique of Galen, who had argued that the liver was the first and most important organ of the body. Harvey concluded the opposite, quote, the lungs make the spirits and indicate the nourishment, wherefore more worthy than the liver, if honor is judged by benefit. End quote. Instead, he drew inspiration from Aristotle in arguing that spirit was not a product of air, but of blood, and the lungs were therefore indicative of a person's temperament. Bold people have hot lungs. Timid people have cold lungs. While creating a new physiology that gave greater importance to the lungs, Harvey was nonetheless deeply indebted to older traditions of thought. As a practicing physician, he also recognized that healthy lungs were essentially to the overall health of the body. I think they need to somebody needs to check the grammar here. In anticipation of more modern attitudes towards this organ, he wrote that exercise was important to the maintenance of this organ. He still, of course, had no idea about oxygen, nor even knew this word. Okay, now we'll return to PubMed database. Citation fucking needed. The evolution, form, and function of the human respiratory system. Abstract. This paper presents an updated view on the morphological and functional significance of the human respiratory system in the context of human evolutionary anatomy. While usually the respiratory system is treated either from a craniofacial perspective, mostly in the context of nasal evolution and air conditioning, or from a postcranial perspective featuring an overall thoracic shape changes, focusing on overall thoracic shape changes, here we pursue a holistic perspective on the form, function, integration, and evolutionary change of the entire organismal systems in hominins. We first present a brief review of the most important morphological structures, their function, and its potential integration and interaction with the nasal cavity and thoracic skeleton. This is followed by an overview of the most important improvements in methods for the comparative study in recent humans and fossil hominins. We then overview and list a compendium of hominin fossil material currently available for the study. We propose 4 functional categories of hominin respiratory system configurations that differ potentially with respect to size, shape, biomechanics, and/or bioenergetics. Finally, we discuss these and speculate on possible ways for future research into an anatomical system that, despite its under-investigated status, is central to the understanding of the form and functions of the hominin organism and its paleobiology. And that's just an abstract. It's kind of strange. It shows us the abstract of the paper, but not the paper. That's not helpful. I love how there's an AI overview here. We'll leave that cited there, even though it didn't really do anything for us. Oh, that's probably too long for a comment, huh? I'll put it in the Descript. No. Use my data. Fuck you. The human lung. Did evolution get it wrong? From the European Respiratory Journal. I have a feeling somebody is about to come enter my room. We'll see. Okay. Is this going to tell us? Yes, okay. Oh, this is pretty thorough too. Okay. So the abstract on this one says some 300 million years ago, the ancestors of modern reptiles emerged from water and were committed to air breathing. They were exothermic and incapable of sustained levels of high physical activity, but from them evolved the two great classes of vertebrates with high levels of maximal oxygen consumption, the mammals and birds. A remarkable feature of these two divergent evolutionary lines is that, although the physiology of many organ systems shows many similarities, the lungs are radically different. A major difference is that the ventilation of the gas-exchanging tissue has a flow-through pattern in the bird, but is reciprocating in the mammal. The result is that mammals have a reduced alveolar and arterial oxygen tension, a potential for uneven ventilation, and relatively large terminal air spaces. This in turn means that the pulmonary capillaries are poorly supported compared with the bird. The result is that the pulmonary capillaries in the bird have much thinner and more uniform walls, with more efficient gas exchange. Other advantages of the bird lung are that it utilizes a more efficient cross-current pattern of gas exchange, and the bird has separated the ventilatory and gas exchange functions. From a structure-function standpoint, the bird lung is superior. Two evolutionary paths, mammals and birds. Some 300 million years ago, the ancestors of modern reptiles finally emerged completely from water and made a commitment to air breathing. Like modern reptiles, they were exothermic and incapable of sustained levels of high physical activity. Is this repeating the abstract? Oh, but okay. Yeah, I repeated the first part of the abstract, but then okay. But from them developed the two great classes of vertebrates with high of maximal oxygen consumption. I don't know why they can't properly proofread these things. The mammals and birds. Specifically, the mammals are thought to have derived from a group of carnivorous reptiles, the cynodonts, while the birds descended from theropod dinosaurs. 1. A remarkable feature of these two groups is that although the physiology of the cardiovascular, renal, gastrointestinal, endocrine, and nervous systems show many similarities, the lungs are radically different. The thesis of the present article is that the bird lung is superior to that of the mammal, and that evolution went along the wrong path for the latter. Flow-through versus reciprocating ventilation. The lung is a gas exchanger that is in many ways similar to a heat exchanger. For example, the radiator of a car. The radiator's function is to remove heat from the coolant fluid coming from the engine, just as the lung removes carbon dioxide from the blood coming from the tissues. At the same time, in the lungs, oxygen is taken up. Figure 1a shows the time-honored design of a car radiator, where the coolant fluid is pumped through an array of small, thin-walled tubes over which air is passed by a fan or the motion of the car. The gas-exchanging unit of the bird lung the parabronchial tissue is similar to this. Figure 1b shows a variant where the gas or heat exchanger is placed in a bellows, which is alternately inflated and deflated. This would work, although the fact that some air remains in the bellows at the end of the deflation reduces its efficiency. Figure 1c shows another variant where the small tubes through which the blood or coolant runs are alternately compressed and expanded by the bellows. An engineer might immediately object that this design is likely to be prone to problems, in part because the delicate tubes with their thin walls may be damaged by the repeated movement. However, amazingly, this is the arrangement that has evolved for the mammalian lung. This is even more surprising given that the more elegant and simple design of figure 1a evolved in the bird. The pattern of reciprocating ventilation apparently developed as long as 200 million years ago in the non-avian theropod dinosaurs. By contrast, flow in the avian lung is of the flow-through type. It is also unidirectional and continuous, although this is not obvious from figure 2. The reason is that aerodynamic valving results in the same direction of gas flow in the parabronchi during both inspiration and expiration, although the precise mechanism is still not completely understood. In fact, the reciprocating pattern of ventilation in the mammalian lung results in additional complications that are not apparent from figure 1c. The mammalian lung does not empty completely with each expiration, as could conceivably be the case with the arrangement depicted in figure 1c. The human lung, for example, maintains a resting gas volume of I'm assuming that's liters. Is it liters? No, it's going to be liters. Maybe. Anyway, and during inspiration, takes on 0.5 liters of air. The result is that convective flow alone cannot take the inspired gas to the periphery of the lung where some of the gas exchanging alveoli are located. Instead, the last part of the distance is accomplished by a combination of convection and diffusion within the airways. This necessitates relatively large peripheral airways to allow mixing of the inspired gas with that already in the lung, and the resulting large alveoli caused additional problems as discussed below. Table 1 lists some of the major differences between mammalian and avian lungs and their gas exchange. The reciprocating pattern of ventilation in the mammalian lung results in 3 shortcomings compared with the bird lung. Potential for uneven ventilation. An implication of figures 2 and 3 is that less inspired gas may reach the peripheral regions of the mammalian lung than the central portions. This type of uneven ventilation is known as stratified inhomogeneity. It is remarkable that the structure of the airways and the alveoli is such that the degree of uneven ventilation as a result of this mechanism is small at rest in the human lung. But it probably increases during rapid breathing, as in exercise, when less time is available for diffusion equilibration to occur. A related problem is that most proximal alveoli in the acinus are preferentially provided with inspired oxygen, with the result that more distal alveoli tend to receive less, a process known as screening. The flow-through arrangement of the bird lung does not have these disadvantages, although it is true that some diffusion does take place in the small air capillaries that bud off the parabronchi or their extensions. However, the diffusion distance is small compared with that in the mammalian lung and is not believed to impose any limitation on gas exchange. The pool pattern of ventilation results in a low alveolar oxygen tension. As Figure 3 emphasizes, a relatively small volume of inspired gas is delivered into a large pool of gas already in the mammalian lung. The result is that the alveolar and therefore arterial oxygen pressure are considerably lower than that of the inspired gas. For instance, in the human lung, and we, again, numbers, so it's really 100 meters. In contrast to the oxygen pressure of the inspired gas, so it's 13.3 kPa in the human lung versus 20 kPa. In the flow-through system of the bird lung reduces this problem. The reciprocating pattern necessitates large terminal air units. As Figure 3 implies, inspired gas can only reach the peripheral regions of the mammalian lung by a combination of convection and diffusion. And this means the terminal air spaces must be relatively large to reduce the resistance within them. For example, in the human lung, the alveoli have a diameter of 300, whereas the air capillaries that surround the blood capillaries in the bird lung have a diameter 5% of this, although this is variable depending on the species. As discussed below, this has important implications for the support of the pulmonary capillaries and the integrity of the extended alveolar walls. Separation of the gas exchange and ventilatory functions. One of the most fundamental differences between the structure of bird and mammalian lung is the separation of the gas exchange function from the ventilatory function in the former. This is clear from Figures 1 and 2. The bioengineering requirements of tissues for these two functions are so dissimilar that it is truly remarkable that the mammalian lung has combined the two functions. Gas exchanging units require extremely thin walls because gas movement across them is by passive diffusion. In the human lung, for instance, approximately half of the blood-gas barrier has a thickness of 0.2 to 0.3, and the bird lung barrier is typically even thinner. By contrast, ventilating structures need to be freely distortable so that they can increase their volume during inspiration. In the bird lung, this is done by non-vascular air sacs, which are robust in contrast to the alveoli of the mammalian lung, which are necessarily delicate because of their extremely thin-walled capillaries. In view of the different structural requirements for ventilation and gas exchange, it is remarkable that the mammalian lung does not encounter more frequent problems as a result of the combination of these two functions. However, potential problems arise in two settings. Occlusion of airways by aspiration or secretions. A common serious problem in the postoperative setting is occlusion of an airway by aspiration or retained secretions. The result is that ventilation to many of the gas exchanging units is abolished with consequent hypoxemia. Indeed, in some cases, the lung distal to the occlusion may become atelectatic. Another word we'll have to look up. Atelectatic means a partial or complete collapse of the lung. Okay. This is particularly likely to occur if the patient is inhaling an enriched oxygen mixture, because the alveolar gas is then more rapidly absorbed. Localized airway occlusion also commonly occurs in airway diseases such as chronic bronchitis and asthma. This scenario of substantial impairment of gas exchange following blockage of an airway is an inevitable result of combining gas exchange and ventilatory functions in the same lung parenchyma. Presumably, the bird avoids these problems to a large extent, as inhaled material will end up in the non-vascular air sacs, with little resulting impairment of gas exchange. Is repetitive distortion of alveolar tissue a factor in its destruction? One of the commonest serious lung diseases in humans is emphysema, characterized by breakdown of the alveolar walls. Furthermore, the apparently normal aging lung may also have some loss of alveolar walls. It is tempting to believe that the distortion that occurs in the delicate gas exchange parenchyma with every breath may be a factor in these conditions. Parenchyma, apparently I am pronouncing it correctly, I think, is the bulk of functional substance in an animal organ or structure, such as a tumor. In zoology, it is the name for the tissue that fills the interior of flatworms. In botany, it is used to refer to some layers in the cross section of the leaf. Okay. Rigid versus deformable gas exchanging tissue. This is another major difference between the bird and mammalian lung, related to the separation of the gas exchange and ventilatory functions discussed above. In the mammalian lung, the parenchyma is deformable, as of course it must be, because the lung changes its volume with inspiration and expiration. By contrast, there's good evidence that the parenchyma of the avian lung is extraordinarily rigid. For instance, if the pressure around the parabronchi is increased during experiments on anesthetized ducts, there is no collapse of the air capillaries as inferred from exchanges in the arterial blood gases. This behavior is completely different from that in the mammalian lung, where compression of the parenchyma causes cessation of ventilation, alveolar collapse, and arterial hypoxemia. Furthermore, there is evidence of rigid support of the pulmonary capillaries. In other experiments on anesthetized ducts, where the pulmonary artery to one lung is occluded, there is essentially no change in the pulmonary vascular resistance of the unoccluded lung. Again, this is a very different result from that in mammals, where the same intervention causes a dramatic fall in vascular resistance of the unoccluded lung as a result of the distension and recruitment of capillaries. These demonstrations of the rigidity of both the air and blood capillaries in the bird emphasize the robustness of the gas-exchanging tissue, in contrast to the delicate, vulnerable parenchyma of the mammalian lung. Small versus large terminal gas units and support of the pulmonary capillaries. As indicated earlier, the combination of convection and diffusion is necessary to transport gas to the periphery of the lung in the reciprocating mammalian pattern necessitates relatively large terminal airways. Typically, histological sections are reproduced in Figure 4. In a mammalian lung, the alveoli are relatively large, and the pulmonary capillaries are strung out along the alveolar wall, rather like a string of beads. Figure 4a shows the structure of the gas-exchanging tissue in a typical bird lung, chicken. The air capillaries, which constitute the terminal gas units, have a diameter of 10 to 20 and form a honeycomb-like network around the pulmonary capillaries. We still have to find out what this unit of measurement is. me just do a quick search on that. It's a micrometer. Okay. See, we're learning something new every day. The present authors believe that this arrangement in the bird parabronchi has important implications for the mechanical support of the pulmonary capillaries, as Figure 4b shows. The capillaries in the alveolar lung are only supported in one direction, that is, along the alveolar wall, and they have no mechanical support at right angles to the wall. As a result, they are vulnerable to damage to their walls when the capillary transmural pressure rises to high levels, for instance, during vigorous exercise. This damage, known as stress failure, occurs in many mammalian lungs under extreme physiological conditions and also in many pathological conditions. One of the best known examples under physiological conditions is the exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage that occurs essentially Sorry, I thought I heard something. Apparently it was me. Okay. One of the best known examples under physiological conditions is the exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage that occurs in essentially all thoroughbred racehorses in training. A less dramatic example is seen in elite human athletes exercising at maximal levels, where it has been shown that there are changes in the permeability of the blood-gas barrier. For example, bronchoalveolar lavage fluid removed after intense exercise shows increases in the concentration of red blood cells, total protein, and leukotriene B4. Pathological conditions where stress failure of pulmonary capillaries occurs include high-altitude pulmonary edema, neurogenic pulmonary edema, and the overinflation of the lung caused by high positive and end expiratory pressure. By contrast, the fact that the pulmonary capillaries in the bird are embedded in a honeycomb-like network of air capillaries means that they receive mechanical support from a number of directions, as can be seen from figures 4a and 5a. Struts or bridges between adjacent air capillaries are attached to the pulmonary capillaries. These struts are composed of epithelial cell extensions without endothelial cells. They apparently explain the remarkable rigidity of the pulmonary capillaries referred to in the previous section, although in such small complex structures as shown in figures 4a and 5a, the distribution of stresses is not fully understood. The blood-gas barrier of birds is much thinner and more uniform than mammals. The present authors believe that the mechanical support provided to the pulmonary capillaries by the surrounding small air capillaries in the bird lung means that the blood-gas barrier in the bird can be much thinner in the mammal, with obvious advantages for gas exchange. Previous investigators have shown that the blood-gas barrier in the avian lung is typically thinner than in mammals, and that in fact some birds have thinner barriers than any mammals. Examples include the rock martin and the violet-eared hummingbird, where the harmonic mean thickness is greater than 0.1 what would we say micrometers, compared with 0.33 micrometers in the Etruscan shrew, the mammal with the thinnest barrier. Micrometers or micrometers? I don't know. Recent measurements in the present author's laboratory have confirmed the very thin blood-gas barrier in the domestic chicken. In addition, the thickness of the three components of the blood-gas barrier, alveolar epithelium, capillary endothelium, and extracellular matrix, or ECM, or interstitium between these two layers, has been measured showing that the ECM in the chicken is extraordinarily thin. This is a paradox because the ECM is believed to be responsible for the strength of the barrier, and birds are capable of extremely high maximal oxygen consumptions in relation to their body weight. Flying is a very energetic activity. Intense exercise raises the pulmonary vascular pressures, including the transmural pressure of the capillaries, and exposes the blood-gas barrier to large mechanical stresses. It is therefore paradoxical that the bird can have extremely thin ECM in the blood-gas barrier and yet be capable of extreme physical activity. The present authors suggest that the solution to this paradox is that the support of the capillaries by the epithelial struts described above helps to maintain the integrity of the capillary walls. An example of the very thin blood-gas barrier in the bird compared with a thick barrier in a typical mammal is shown in Figure 5. Another important feature of the blood-gas barrier is apparent in Figure 5. In Figure 5b, the right-hand part of the blood-gas barrier is very thin, being composed only of the alveolar epithelium, capillary endothelium, and a thin layer of ECM, box 2. By contrast, the blood-gas barrier on the left-hand side of Figure 5b, box 1, is much thicker, as the interstitium is expanded and includes type 1 collagen fibrils. Interstitium. The interstitium is a contiguous fluid-filled space existing between a structural barrier, such as a cell membrane or the skin, and the internal structures, such as organs, including muscles and the circulatory system. These appearances are typical of mammalian pulmonary capillaries. The collagen seen in box 1 is a part of a type 1 collagen cable that runs from one end of the alveolar wall to the other, threading its way through one side or the other of the capillaries en route. The purpose of this collagen cable is to maintain the integrity of the long alveolar wall, which is generally poorly supported. The result is a polarized mammalian pulmonary capillary, whereby on one side, the blood-gas barrier is extremely thin and well suited to gas exchange, while the other side is thicker because of the collagen cable. Figure 5a shows that the structure of the blood-gas barrier in the bird is very different. First, the total thickness of the barrier is much less than in the mammalian pulmonary capillary. In addition, inspection of the blood-gas barrier in Figure 5a shows that it is remarkably uniform and certainly does not show the polarization characteristic of the barrier in Figure 5b. The current authors believe that the explanation for this is that the pulmonary capillaries in the bird lung are embedded in a honeycomb-like structure of air capillaries, and there is no long alveolar wall, requiring a type 1 collagen cable for support. Morphometric measurements confirm that typically about half of the blood-gas barrier of the mammalian lung has the characteristics of box 1 in Figure 5b, whereas about half has the structure shown in box 2. The structure of the blood-gas barrier in the bird lung in Figure 5a is clearly much more advantageous for gas exchange than the barrier of Figure 5b. Not only is the barrier generally thinner, but it is also remarkably uniform. This appearance is contrasted with the generally thicker barrier in the mammalian lung and the fact that mammals apparently require a substantial type 1 collagen cable to maintain the integrity of the alveolar walls. In fact, the considerable thickness of the left-hand side of the capillary wall in Figure 5b means that this region plays only a small part in diffusive gas exchange. Okay, great, Dave. And then it gives you another box. Just go away. The pattern of cross-current gas exchange in the bird lung is very efficient. As described in connection with Figure 3, the reciprocating pattern of ventilation in the mammal results in a pool system of gas exchange, which necessarily means that and therefore blah blah blah. So this has something to do with the ratio of oxygen to yeah. Figure that one out. Here, let's Google it. We seem to be able to find all the answers we're looking for if we look for them hard enough. The arterial oxygen pressure, PaO2, can be directly assessed with an arterial blood gas test, or estimated with a venous blood gas test. The alveolar oxygen pressure, PaO2. Oh, so there's a difference here. The arterial has is the small a, and the alveolar has the large a. Okay. But yeah, we're talking about yeah, that's the pressure ratio. Okay. And okay, so are substantially below the inspired values. The bird lung largely avoids this problem because of its flow-through pattern of ventilation. In addition, the avian lung has a remarkably efficient arrangement of air and blood capillaries for pulmonary gas exchange, which has been described extensively elsewhere, and will be summarized here. In the avian parabronchi, the blood capillaries run alongside the air capillaries, which branch off the parabronchi, or their extensions. And part of the effluent capillary blood is exposed to gas with an oxygen pressure close to the inspired value. The net result of this cross-current gas exchange, as it is called, is that it potentially allows the oxygen pressure of the blood leaving the lung to exceed that of the expired gas. This is impossible in the mammalian lung, where the best result that can be achieved is that the end capillary blood reaches the oxygen tension of the alveolar gas, which is subsequently exhaled. This special arrangement for gas exchange, which is unique to the avian lung, improves gas exchange efficiency. Okay. The evolutionary success of birds. Why did mammals take a different route? From our mammalian perspective, it might be thought that as a taxon, mammals have been more successful than birds. However, the opposite case can be made. For instance, some birds are superior to any mammals in their maximal oxygen consumption in relation to body weight. Their aerobic scope, the number of extant species, 9,000 in birds versus 4,200 in mammals, and arguably their ecological diversity. The mountaineers struggling to reach the summit of Everest may see bar-headed geese flying far above. So why did evolution take what appears to be such a flawed path in the mammal? The question is probably not a useful one. Evolution proceeds in an incremental way without a final goal. At various points along the line, there are changes in a few base pairs which confer an advantage or disadvantage for survival. But for those who work on the mammalian lung, it is fascinating that evolution found a better solution for the structure-function relationship of the lung in birds than in mammals. And we'll stop there for tonight. This has clearly been my the object of my obsession as of late. We'll come back and look at this again later. So this study comes again from the European Respiratory Journal. And it's going to tie back into many questions we'd asked. Like, if God designed all the creeping, crawling, flying things on the earth as well as humans, why did he give birds better lungs than us? Arguably, potentially. Just a thought. Anyway, I've got shit to do. I'm going to get out of here. Much love. Be well. Stay trusty. Continue learning. And I'll see you on the next episode.